So, before we begin, in an effort to allow people to float in just after 4 o'clock, and before I introduce Cornel and we get started, I'd like to share a little story with everyone. So, you know how we've been talking here over the past few weeks about Trump, the election, all the rest of it, and one of the themes has been this kind of global revulsion about the elites who govern us, right? We lost faith in them, all this stuff. Just give me a minute, right? This just in. An heir to the Fiat fortune in Italy stands accused of falsely claiming he had been kidnapped by a transgender prostitute. Lapo Elkan called his family from New York to demand $10,000 ransom to guarantee his safety. But having found him in Manhattan, investigators now believe he concocted the story after he ran out of money following a drink and drugs binge. The grandson of Fiat's Gianni Agnelli is due in court on January. He was arrested on misdemeanor charges of falsely reporting an incident, having only arrived in the US last week. The Italian told his Instagram followers he was going abroad to pursue a lot of projects in development. Dressed in a bright red suit, he said the business trip would bring him in contact with many interesting characters. Instead, reports in the US and Italy say the 39-year-old spent 2 days with a woman before calling his family in order to get more money. He claimed he'd been held in a Manhattan flat from 1700 on Friday until police arrested him outside a public housing complex about 2 a.m. on Sunday. That's one of the richest people in Italy. Hey, seriously, is there any wonder? I mean, you know, what can you do? Someone who's going to explain all that to us is Cornel.
Oh my goodness.
That's your setup. Hang on, I'm not done yet.
Okay.
Cornel Ban is an assistant professor of international relations at Boston University. He's also a dear personal friend, and he's also one of my ex-PhDs. So believe it or not, they do exist. They happen, and they go on to have successful jobs and careers and become reasonably well-adjusted people. So without further ado, I give you one of my greatest achievements, Cornel Ban.
You're hopeless. Yeah.
Thank you.
A couple of acknowledgements. Of course, Mark Blyth, who is responsible for at least half of the material that goes into this book. It's based on about 30%, 40% of it based on dissertation. The Watson Institute, because I wrote about a third of it here, you know, many people in this room that I have thanks to give as well. So this is a book that came out in June and with Oxford University Press, and the idea is
the mic?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, well.
Yeah. All right. So you know, why bother with this, right? This is the check that is being paid for the promises made by neoliberalism, and the bouncing check is this comandante here in a very 19th century uniform. But it is a problem that's quite central to existing debate about what's wrong with democratic politics today. And this is not just an American story; it is a much broader story, and you know, the attempt to endogenize it to the American reality, I think, is symptomatic of many of the blind spots in the analysis of neoliberalism in the last 30 years. So if you look at this, you know, for about 10 years, when I was writing my dissertation, using the word neoliberalism was basically very threatening for your career. It was a very fuzzy word, and it wouldn't be something you'd use in a job talk in political science, circa 2008. Now, this is a paper that was written by one of the oldest hands in the IMF this summer that uses the N-word. And they define it, and they argue it was oversold, and then we're going to pay a very big price for it. So in this historical moment, you also have voices from the left, right, arguing, you know, is this the apocalypse of neoliberalism, with Trump promising, you know, retrenchment behind trade barriers and trade openness being one of the fundamental goals of neoliberalism? Of course, there must be something wrong with it. So this is Cornel West, spelled with one L. We share that one, taking that view, right? So the dependent variable is neoliberalism, the N-word, which are defined in this book as a set of economic theories embedded into a political project. And unlike existing definitions, I draw on Blyth's earlier work to look at neoliberalism in a very precise, measurable way. It is economic theories that economists recognize, rather than economic theories that social scientists attribute to economists and they do not recognize in the process. Because if you do that, you can actually identify it as it morphs into various ideological constructions over time. The empirical context in which this is studied is about half a century of Southern European and East European history. It's a story of how this neoliberal script developed in United States, Britain, and a few people see this a lot, but Germany. Germany is a very important contributor to the neoliberal nebula. And how this played out in Southern Europe with the focus on Spain, and Eastern Europe with the focus on Romania. So we're looking at the great historical democratic transitions taking place in the 70s and later on in the 90s, how they adapted neoliberalism to local reality at very different moments of joining Europe. And then the other half of the book deals with how this knowledge regime and policy regime survived the Great Recession. Because the Great Recession, in a sort of Kuhnian sense, is a thesis of disconfirmation of many of the fundamental theses of this project. So the book is as much about 50 years of Southern European and East European integration into a broader transnational neoliberal project, as well as a very different reaction to the Great Recession. So here, this is the Spaniards, the tireless, more hipster types, 1970s, singing the International. They also happen to become the architects of a very specific translation of neoliberalism in Spain, kind of more moderate and more progressive. And then on the right, equally dashing. The prime minister is always dashing. The president and the advisor is not usually, right? So this is the Romanian post-communist types who attempt a very similar move, but at a very different historical moment, at the end of history moment, when the translation of neoliberalism leads to something a little bit more radical in a sort of market fundamentalist sense, right? And zooming, right, into the Great Recession, this is the Prime Minister Zapatero contemplating with a relaxed gaze what's happening to his country's sovereign debt in 2009, 2010. And that's his Romanian counterpart basically going after the head of the IMF for being a socialist. They thought that the IMF austerity imposed on Romania was too soft. So this is the sort of historical context, but I want to first clarify what the hell is neoliberalism, because a recent article counted about 89 definitions, and depending on which one of them you use, you're going to reach extremely different analytical conclusions. So one of the most popular out there is Joe Stiglitz's, and both the left and the right uses this version. Neoliberalism is a kind of market fundamentalism, a kind of Austrian school, hardcore markets on turbo, small government, Tea Party version, right? Now the problem with this definition is that it doesn't really account for the real existing neoliberalism. It doesn't account for too big to fail. It doesn't account for tax systems that redistribute income upwards. These are all forms of state intervention. Most importantly, it is historically inaccurate, considering the Polanyian dictum that it was the state that created the market rather than the other way around. So I think if we go this route, we're going to pronounce the end of neoliberalism every 3 years, right? Whenever there's a problem out there and a major bailout of the financial sector, or soon probably the construction sector in the United States, we're going to proclaim the end of it all. The other position is taken, is more of a political science position. This is a quote from the flagship journal, International Organization. It's basically this conflation between neoliberalism and neoclassical economics. And that's a really hugely problematic thing. I'm from Romania. I met socialist economists who are market socialists. This definition would apply to every single thing that they said before '89, right? Moreover, the argument that market actors have rational beliefs is very peripheral in real existing economics. So if you're going to go to the top journals in economics, you're not going to find that. People think that this is a bit of a joke. It's like in 1970s relic. So real existing economics is not what social scientists think it is, especially many political scientists. Likewise, fiscal discipline, you can have rational expectations models, that lead to fiscal expansions, right? So this whole definition, which is kind of quintessential to how most people from Harvard to IO today is using neoliberalism, is bankrupt from the perspective of how economists actually understand it. Now, this is how I define it. Again, going back to the Blythian position, you have to identify schools of economic thought that are being taught in economics, are labeled as such, and are published as such. So that when you read an IMF report, or that's more technical, or you read an economic review article, you can actually put your finger on it and call it as such, right? So from the left to the right, I mean, new Keynesians are neoliberal. Greg Mankiw, an advisor to George Bush, is one of them. And you can go all the way to the right to the Austrian school and the more radicals, with the Germans there, the ordoliberal school, being quite critical. But here's the problem with this, right? Whenever these kind of international German or American or British scripts go local in China or Chile or Romania, right? They look very different from how they were designed and how they are understood in these kind of global elite circles. So the one thing, when real existing neoliberalism, just like real existing Keynesianism or Soviet socialism, right, is a hybrid and localized construction that absorbs a lot of the local historical intellectual legacies, material interests, and so on and so forth, right? And second, and this is something that most political economists miss on. They have a sort of ahistorical definition of neoliberalism. If you actually open up most of the textbooks or university books pressed or university press books today, they still talk about monetarism as being a big deal. That's a 1970s theory of neoliberalism that died in about 83. Like nobody's a serious, pure monetarist anymore. So the book is going to take you in a very different historically contingent definition that says, all right, these were the dominant schools in the 70s, these were the dominant schools in the 80s, this is the dominant schools today. Because only thus can we understand why, for example, the IMF, which is a stronghold of very consummate mainstream economists, is able to, for example, critique European austerity. Simply because this kind of more contemporary version that's very different from the Reagan era allows you to make such policy recommendations, simply because the assumptions embedded in the new models and the calibrations that you can do can enable you to look more Keynesian, quote unquote. Doesn't mean that they are Keynesians per se. This is another mistake being made. Everybody's saying, the IMF is Keynesian. It's actually not true. It's a calibration of a much broader concept, right? So this is an example. These are the 500 or so economists that have debated Europe on the austerity debate, right? And these are the reformists, these are the orthodox. This is kind of like pre-crisis neoliberalism as we understand it conventionally. And then these are the people in the more reformist brand with their institutions. So another contribution of the book is to take us into a methodological space where you can identify exactly who are the people in the IMF that you can expect to have Keynesian views and build alliances with them, right? Or to be, if you're, say, Greece, to stay away from these guys, right? So when you try to understand the politics of neoliberalism in such a key global institution, right, it's important to see, what are the various factions within it. I could go in the Q&A over the method of doing this, but the basic point is that conventional definitions of neoliberalism will delude us that this is, a Keynesian construction. No, I mean, the old school people are still there and shooting hard. Now, this definition can allow for a lot of confusion, except if you take a view of it that stresses what are the commonalities of all these schools of thought from the early 70s until today, from new classical, hardcore Minnesota school economics to today's more wishy-washy, pinko economics, right? And the three things that hold them together are three policy goals that can be derived from these models and theories and ideas. The first one is whatever you do, whether it's macroeconomic policy or more micro, whether it's about tax and spend or it's about quantitative easing, it's got to be credible with the bond markets. So the vote of capital is ultimately what mediates any of the policy implications that these very different theories might come up with. That's very important, right? So, whenever we talk about the limits to democracy or the limits to innovating within existing economics, that's a big veto point, yeah? The second goal is trade and financial openness, right? So free trade, the regulated finance across borders is something they all have in common, including the sort of left New Keynesian faction where, you find people like Krugman and others. And third, the idea of internal and external competitiveness. It's a big concept, but one thing I would put my stress on is, for example, if you go into a recession, you cut wages in order to export more. That's the kind of automatic thing that you do. Now, you can tinker with that and talk about public investment having a role and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the theories of growth that we have out there from the 70s until today argue that rather than the aggregate demand management, this is the internal and external competitiveness boosting is what's on the table. Now, compare this with the Keynesian era, yeah? Where the goals are very different, right? There you have a lot of diversity between sort of left Marxian Keynesians and sort of more neoclassically minded ones. The goals there are very different, as you can see in this kind of aquatic metaphor. The first is the stabilization of aggregate demand across cycles, right? Making sure that whether it's recessions or good times, aggregate demand is roughly the same, right? So the hero here is the working class, the wage earners, and so on and so forth. The second is full employment, right? This idea of human waste via underemployment and unemployment is a big ideological and technical argument that Keynesians have. And the third one is that only a mixed and regulated capitalism can work, right? The idea of purely private, deregulated capitalism is a delusion, and it's going to collapse with huge political costs on a regular basis. Now that I've clarified this, it's important to understand that the definition I give draws on Polanyi and the politics of distribution that this has, right? So as I said, once you buy into these goals, there's a lot of things you can tinker about at the periphery of the paradigm, right? So for example, Sweden has one of the most orthodox central banks in the world, one of the most orthodox fiscal policies, Denmark, another Nordic country, very deregulated labor market. They are all free traders and sort of arguing, usually standing for deregulated finance in international fora, right? But the difference here is the class politics, right? What kind of politics of distribution make a difference between these varieties of neoliberalism? So the question is not whether we're still inside or outside of neoliberalism, but what kind of neoliberalism do you live with? Because it makes a huge damn difference whether you're bottom 30% of the income distribution and you live in England or United States, or whether you live in Denmark, right? So this kind of, the class politics in the definition of neoliberalism is what I bring in as a major contribution. So what are the tools of this distribution politics that I'm looking at? So I argue that there are two large categories of neoliberal policy and intellectual regimes, right? The first one is, again, the Polanyian term, embedded neoliberalism, right? So you have all these, markets and freedom of capital across borders and so on and so forth. But you also have many buffer zones, right? You have many airbags. Whether it's about, Denmark would fit this, right? And Spain, to some extent, until this crisis. I'm going to get into that. So collective bargaining, unions, minimum wages, this didn't disappear in most of Europe, right? They were weakened but didn't leave, and nobody's until 2010 really arguing very hard for them. The idea of regulated finance, the idea of public banks doing the bidding of aggregate demand management, right? Within the neoliberal nebula. Progressive taxes, welfare state, we know the good stuff. In the case of Spain, which ended up with this variety during their democratic transition, the kind of competing schools of thought for the local translation of neoliberalism were very different than they were in Romania. So this gentleman here on the left he looks the part, right? So he's the Prussian aristocrat, was in the Waffen-SS, and he escaped Germany for Franco-Spain after his friends got shot by Hitler during the famous conspiracy, right? He's basically bailed out by a Spanish fascist who sees in him more of a real fascist than what Germany could have allowed for. Now, this guy completely restructured Spanish economics. He was one of the most efficient anti-Keynesians in modern economics at the time. He was published in American Economics Review. He was a very big deal. His theory of macroeconomics still is fundamental to how we understand it. And basically, Spain never really got a sort of very hardcore Keynesian policy regime like France and Britain and others did, because he was imagine Krugman is thrown out by Trump and gets a job in Bulgaria, right? I mean, he would remake Bulgarian economics for the next 20 years. That's what happened with him here. He was like a superstar. But during the 1970s, as Spain democratized, also from Germany came a sort of pushback against this hard market push. And the dashing gentleman with the cigarette, that is the Chancellor Willy Brandt, who pushed the German mainstream economics in a sort of a more social liberal, social democratic direction in the late 60s and early 70s. So as Spain democratized, these two dimensions of Spanish understanding of modern economics fused into this kind of embedded, yes?
Do you want to tell us the first guy's name?
Oh, Friedrich von Stackelberg. Yes, sorry, Freiherr von Stackelberg. I didn't find a uniform of his in the classical SS wool Feldgrau uniform, but too bad. Now, interestingly, for Romania's version of this is what Romania is, a former communist country, right? Spain is a kind of like a fascist country for a while, but definitely authoritarian and right-wing. So it goes slightly with a left quote-unquote, take on liberalism as a result of this clashing German influences mostly. For the Romanians, it's the opposite. So all the labels that you've seen earlier on, put the minus sign and get the opposite, right? So just to give you an example, whenever you have a crisis, you believe in expansionary austerity because that's the way to grow again, right? The regulate finance is going to give it to growth, busting unions, the whole litany of things. But why did this happen in the first place, right? Why did leading policymakers acquire this understanding of it, right? And the historical moment is really important. Spain transitions in the 1970s when Keynesianism is still alive and kicking for a little bit, right? And when it dies by the late 70s, is this kind of German social democratic versions of ordoliberal economics that are about very orthodox monetary and fiscal policies, but it's about labor union, it's about universal health care, which is adopted in 1 year in Spain, by the way, shame on this country. Whereas when the Romanians do it, right, it's a very different moment, right? You have this kind of end of history moment with Austrian economics giving a new inflection to mainstream economics, but the most important thing are the American Austrians. The gentleman there on the left flirting with the Gipper is Arthur Laffer. Arthur Laffer is a very important figure for this administration and the way they're going to do the tax reform. And these are precisely the people that, while marginal in mainstream economics, because you're not really, Austrians are not taken seriously by the mainstream. Neither was Arthur Laffer. But their ideas traveled in circles of power in ways that an economic profession as isolated as the Romanian one was much more vulnerable to. Okay? Now, why is it that the Spanish have ended up stressing more the embedded side of neoliberalism than the Romanians did, beyond this kind of like local intellectual legacies influenced by very different German influences? Yeah? And there are three, this is a very sort of Bourdieusian take, if you wish, on the importance of three forms of capital that mediate this diffusion process. So my book looks at, literally, I didn't want to be confused by people asking me, like, how do you know these ideas matter? Well, I said, okay, fine, they may not matter, but if you are one of the translators of neoliberalism, and you are the damn Minister of Finance or Prime Minister or Head of State or Head of the Central Bank, right? They do matter. This is what constitutes your view of the world, especially when you don't know what the hell is going on with the economy, right? And the second category, much more narrow, as narrowly defined as the first, is advisors to these people, right? But my book doesn't talk about economists who are not part of the policy process. It doesn't talk about the economic profession as such. So there are three kinds of capital that sort of like lead in a more embedded and more disembodied way, and it's a very counterintuitive result. Now, you would expect that the Spaniards, who, having benefited from a much more open sort of education, most of them got their PhDs at LSE with anti-Keynesians for the most part in the 1960s. You would expect them to be like following what's happening in the American and German mainstream in the 1970s during the great neoliberal transition, right? So you would expect them to be more radical than Romanians did because these guys lived under communism, they couldn't even travel in the 1980s, they didn't have subscriptions to the latest issues of the American Economics Review. So why is it that they ended up very differently? Well, it's because very different resources were invested in them. Whether we're looking about status capital, esteem, degrees, recognition, co-authorship, right? Material capital. What kind of money, what kind of endowments were given to specific institutions that generated these technocrats, right? Institutional capital. Why is it that Romania had plenty of heterodox economists in the early 1990s, but they were wielded out by material capital that starved them of resources, yeah, while giving lots of grants and institutional access to the central bank and the negotiating teams with the IMF to people who held more neoliberal views, right? So before we think about coercion and competition in the international market, we have to think about the ideas with which negotiators go to the table with the IMF, for example, right? If you know that the IMF has a lot of sort of left-leaning people on it, like we saw with the reformists in the network, you're going to negotiate a better deal for your bottom of the income distribution. Whereas if you don't, right, you're going to end up with a very different result. So then the IMF usually makes sure that they're going to weave into the policy process those people that hold the more mainstream view. Now, let's explain the status capital for a second in greater detail and to illustrate it. This is a network analysis they've done on the most important policymakers in 30 years of economic policy in Spain. I wanted to see whether these people were internationally well-placed to brag about this kind of capital, right? So I looked at their co-authors. Now, if you look at this, about half of their co-authors, because these are all, you're economically trained, usually, you publish, whether you're a policymaker or whether you're in academia or you're going to the revolving door, which is the case in Spain. Well, you see, half of them are based in Spain, but half are not. Half are based in relatively prestigious Western economic institutions. So when I interviewed them, it was very interesting to find out that they felt that they could experiment more with neoliberalism and pushing it in this kind of more embedded direction. He said, yeah, it's true that the mainstream now is kind of like all pro-market and so on and so forth, but really, there is room for fiscal policy sometimes. And there's no really good arguments for busting labor unions in Spain, right? And then we model things in a way that show things the way we want them to look. It was actually very self-critical discourse. Now, if we apply this to Eastern Europe, these are two networks. And this is the neoliberal transition economics that the Romanians are doing. And then this is the more heterodox transition economics. Because the end of communism, we forget this, is not in the books. But it really was a terrain of struggle between people with very right views and people with left views in economics. Now, the interesting thing is that people with the left views were based in a desk in the World Bank, which is the center of this network, that was subsequently discontinued. Branko Milanovic is one of the survivors, and he's giving us good stuff still. But what you can see here, that it's with very few exceptions, and if you see here UC Berkeley and so on, they're sociologists, they're not economists. This is a very low prestige network from the perspective of mainstream economics. So if you actually embed this kind of network, right, you're going to end up with a more heterodox understanding of economics, provided you actually have the institutional access, right? Now, the previous network, as we can see, this is the network that matters. This is all very mainstream. This is NBER, and it's Stanford and Harvard and the usual suspects, right? So you end up with, this is a high prestige network, high social capital versus low. Now, it's not enough, though, to hang out with the right people from the prestigious institutions, right? You also have to pay your wages, and in semi-peripheral contexts, you can't really live off of an academic wage, right? And this is where things become really interesting, because once you're part of those networks, they usually come with material capital as well. So whenever there's funding opportunities or travel abroad or getting a real library and paying for software, right? This is where money matters. Now, the heterodox could use that help, but nobody was bankrolling them, yeah? So there is a politics of resources that conventional understandings of neoliberalism as a purely gentlemanly fight between intellectuals is missing on. And this is the story of money, right? It's a particularly salient discussion today when we're talking about potentially large systemic changes in economics. Who's going to pay for what research over the next 4 years will be something to keep our eyes on. In the case of Spain, the Germans bankrolled most of what these leading policymakers and their academic advisors were working on, which meant, since Germany had social democratic governments, the money came from the Ebert Stiftung, which we know what views they have. So they bankrolled a version of, sound finance, but with progressive labor legislation and taxes and social services, right? For the Romanians, it was a very different set of actors. It was the IMF and the World Bank at their most conservative moment in the early 90s, this kind of Stanley Fischer's IMF, plus a lot of libertarian American and European interests based around the Fraser Institute and the Atlas Network in Europe. So they ended up with what for them was the new normal, what was Western economics for them, was mediated by this curtain of money that sponsors some things and not others. So this story about bringing in the money when following the ideas is an absolutely critical task. And finally, the institutional capital. Now, this means two things. First, you can endow institutional capital by giving your favorite economists in one of these peripheral countries, a three-year fellow job at the IMF. Because you come home with a different credibility, you're going to be the next negotiator, basically, right? And you're going to be the voice that really matters when people wonder what international bond markets want or what the IMF wants, right? And again, that's a very political choice. Like, who do you take to Washington to endow with this institutional capital? The other form of institutional capital is you basically, to give you a specific example, when you destroy national collective bargaining institutions, yeah? And you make sure that the labor unions are not part of peak-level macroeconomic decision-making, that is a form of institutional rearrangement of whose voice actually matters domestically. And that's not the result of purely domestic politics. That is the result of transnational politics with myriad IFIs and national governments getting involved. In the case of Spain, and of course, European integration is a big story here. Spain joined Europe at the time when destroying labor unions was not fashionable yet. Romania did it when basically the Swedes are allowed to have labor unions, but nobody else does, right? So then it becomes a condition for membership that you reduce labor capital relations to the firm level, yeah? So these are the two facets of institutional capital that made a huge difference in these countries at these very two different historical moments. Okay, and then I talked about material capital here. I'm going the other way, right? Okay. Now, breathing space, yeah? So what? So what if you have these guys with, studied with money and titles and prestige and experiences in the capital of the empire, yeah? Why is that not just a nice set of intellectual tools, but really without a lot of teeth when it comes to the real existing policy? Well, that's why I think in order for us to keep a very tight view that's measurable of the extent to which these ideas have a direct impact, they can have an indirect impact, which I don't deny, but it's not part of this book. I think it's very important to focus on this kind of 6 categories of people, right? Head of state, central bank, and minister of finance. Nobody will go and say, those guys don't matter in an economy. It could be that this could be a vulnerable country that's indebted. Say, think of Greece, 3 years ago. But ultimately, these are the guys you have to negotiate with. So you might hate the hell out of Varoufakis, but he's the minister of finance, right? So what kind of ideas he holds is very important for the political outcomes that come out of it, right? And the second is the advisors. Here, the Romanian and the Spanish story is quite interesting because Spain had a very institutionalized economic profession. Basically, you can't be a central banker or a minister of finance unless you have a PhD abroad or similar, right? In Romania, the first minister of finance and the first bureaucrat, basically, in the economic policy arena with a PhD in the West was a year and a half ago. These are very sort of parochial people who are trained on the cheap in kind of 3-week courses at the IMF's Institute in Vienna, at most, 6 months as a fellow in the IMF, but they don't really have this strong socialization with the Western economic profession that can enable them to see opportunities and gaps in the existing paradigm, and to create room for maneuvering, for maneuver domestically, right? So the kind of quality of the institutions of the economic profession matters. Therefore, in the Romanian case, a lot of the big neoliberal reformers in these positions were not even economists. I mean, some of them were, actually the most important one of them was a psychiatrist, which is very appropriate for selling this paradigm, I guess. People with, GW master's degree in public policy, a tax inspector from a parochial town in the country. And importantly, think tanks. In Spain, basically think tanks couldn't penetrate the policy arena, which was state-controlled, because being an economist required all these credentials, and being part of this kind of policy economist mindset that made think tanks look amateurish. We were still looking at the 1980s when the think tank wasn't a big historical form of influence. In the Romanian case, you get all these amateur economists who have a huge impact, and they come from this kind of Austrian crazy Jude Van Insky and Arthur Laffer school of thought, right? So therefore, even before you negotiate with the IMF or you negotiate European integration, you're going to come to the table and say, you know what? Western capitalism, as we see it, is a sellout. It's basically socialism. It's basically the state controls everything, and the Great Recession, for example, is interpreted in the Romanian case as a failure of a statist capitalism, right? If you have the definition, you don't really need coercion, right? You don't really need the kind of typical forms of capital competition that discipline policymakers in adopting some policies versus others, right? So, and the third variable that we're looking at here is institutional cohesion. Because you can have people who think the same way in the government, but for reasons that have nothing to do with intellectual conviction, but rather with electioneering or other kinds of strategic interests, they might not agree with each other in policy, right? So I test this in several critical crisis episodes, showing how in some situations, everybody was a neoliberal in government, but they didn't pass neoliberal reforms because they didn't have the same institutional incentives lined up, right? So again, right, ideas matter, but so do resources and institutional filters that explain very different policy regimes in the two countries. Now, this is very important for understanding how neoliberalism survived the Great Recession. In Spain, basically the moment the crisis struck, the impulse was to use the existing knowledge repertoire about the economy and how capitalism works, and try to defend the healthcare sector and whatever was left of collective bargaining and progressive taxation and so on and so forth. So the first thing they did, when Spain sees its bond yields go out of control, they tax. This is during the socialist government in 2010. They tax the top 1%, right? They do expenditure cuts, but not. They draw these lines in the sand around healthcare and education and unemployment benefits, right? So they still try to defend this kind of system that they came up with in the 1970s and 80s that says, yes, we embrace capitalism and even neoliberalism, but look, there is room, there is life under neoliberalism, and we're going to make the most out of it. Because we feel, we're hanging out with the neoliberals in the West, we know that there is room, yeah? So, however, the more the crisis extracted social costs from the Spanish society, and it was a brutal, brutal crisis. This is famously the country with the highest youth unemployment alongside Greece. What's happening is that they go too far with this kind of defense. So they're pushing the embeddedness too far. They're bringing in ideas about fiscal stimulus that were not in line with what mainstream neoliberalism was about. And again, right, ideas matter, but ultimately, translating them into policy is constrained. So the Spanish government is basically ruled by correspondence from the ECB. The European Central Bank said, we're going to bail you out, if you adopt a constitutional amendment in late August, those of you who have been to Spain, you know that people there work really hard in late August. And it's the first time that the Spanish constitution, since 77, it's the pride of transitological literature, right, is changed on the fly in order to implement a mandatory fiscal surplus in that country, right? So, you know, when you interviewed the Spanish ministers in charge with this, they said, of course, this was pure coercion. We had no choice because the alternative would have been to be Greece and to be basically out. So the sovereign bond, what sovereign bond markets do, and you know, the central bank when they cooperate with these bond markets, in the Romanian case, for example, yeah, these independent agencies like fiscal councils, whose mandate is to look very closely at government budgets and have the sovereign bond markets view. These are domestic actors, yeah? What the Troika does, yeah? The ECB, the European Commission, the IMF. They can put limits in terms of how much translation of neoliberalism you can do when it comes to neoliberalism becoming something other than an intellectual paradigm and becoming a policy paradigm, right? So there is, in addition to this kind of domestic variables, that institutional cohesion and so on, the vulnerability of a country to capital flight or to the kind of hammer of the bond market actually decides the outcome, right? So yes, you know, Spain couldn't defend its interpretation of embedded neoliberalism, which is why it is the West European country with the greatest increase in inequality outside of Greece, since these reforms were adopted and since this kind of old policy regime was gradually dismantled. So basically, they converged with the Romanians in the end, right? Except without the conviction and the drive that the kind of Austrian school view of neoliberalism that the Romanians had on the table. Okay, so what's the take home here? The first one is that I propose a different definition of neoliberalism that is a class project where distribution really matters, yeah? So embedded if the distribution is downwards, disembedded if it's upwards, right? And, you know, the way austerity was done in Romania is basically distribution upwards. It's the country with the highest growth in the EU, but with the greatest increase in the country is poorer than when they joined the EU, despite being a successful case of recovery, right? That is inspired or legitimized by specific economic theories. So my call here on the debate on neoliberalism is to do the hard work of reading economic theory, because without that, we are unable to trace what they actually, the concrete tools that policymakers and economists use look like. And the danger is that we ascribe to neoliberalism definitions that we use from our own fields, yeah? We do a rehash of Harvey, for example, right? Without noticing that the kind of transformations that neoliberalism suffers. And thus, miscalling neoliberalism, calling it like it's over, it's dead, you know, Trump comes to power, all of a sudden, you know, neoliberalism is over. Rather than it's undergoing a new hybridization. And it's one of its fundamental strengths, the fact that it can blend into local reality and can absorb ideas from competing paradigms. As we saw, you can take a little bit from social democracy and a little idea from Keynesianism, but overall, as long as the core goals are the same, it's still neoliberalism. That's the key thing. The second is a theory of how neoliberalism goes local. So it's not enough to say the neoliberalism is a hybrid, right? I mean, that's kind of a trivial finding at the end of the day. But having a theory that explains varieties of neoliberalism, right? Because that's actually what makes a huge difference for citizens in most countries, whether you are under an embedded or disembedded kind of variety, right? So here, in that explanation, transnational status, material, and institutional resources are important. So I think the kind of constructivist ideational literature has to move into an area where it takes these resources seriously. And not just money, but also status and institutions. So it's a kind of a sociological, materialist understanding of how ideas get translated and how they impact policy. And finally, the half of the book that deals with how neoliberalism survived the crisis of disconfirmation, represented by the Lehman Brothers crisis and then the failure of austerity in Europe, is very important. And here, basically the same mechanisms that explain its various implementations and localizations, plus the importance of coercion and competition, which in the last instance prunes excessive interpretations of neoliberalism that go too far in the direction of competitors, comes to the fore. Now, where does this leave us? It's a Marie Antoinette moment in many ways. And it's particularly depressing that, that the French elections coming up next year produced an outcome whereby the best way to fight a crypto-fascist government potentially winning the elections is a sort of neo-Thatcherite moment. The gentleman on the right from Saint-Fillon is driving a political program is to fire 500,000 civil servants, doctors and teachers and bureaucrats, to essentially privatize most of what's left of what, according to the WHO, is one of the best healthcare systems in the world, publicly run, to do a Reagan-esque, Trump-esque tax reform. So basically, we live through this moment when we are paying the political cost of the social dislocations produced by neoliberalism. But the best answer we can come up with in the Troika or in a key European capital is to have more of the same, in a sort of even radical, disembedded version. So essentially what kept Western neoliberalism in a relatively stable mode until the Great Depression was precisely this embeddedness, right? Now, if the reaction, the political reaction of the establishment is, of the established parties, center-left and center-right, is to deepen the disembeddedness, right? Then I think we remain in a sort of melancholic posture that Marie Antoinette here on the left is throwing at us. Thank you.